All right, buckle up, deep divers, because today we're wading into some pretty murky waters.
Oh, sounds intriguing.
We're talking Armstrongism.
Ah, yes. The world of Herbert W. Armstrong, the worldwide Church of God, and all its offshoots.
Offshoots is right. And we're zeroing in on one that's getting some, shall we say, unique views on baptism.
Unique how?
Well, our primary source is a letter from a minister named John W. Brisby.
John W. Brisby.
He's part of a group called the Church of God, the Eternal, and he's basically saying that a lot of people, even within similar Armstrongite groups, are getting baptism all wrong.
Oh, so there's a right way to get baptized according to him.
Oh, absolutely. He's got a whole checklist, and it's pretty intense.
A checklist? Like what kind of things are we talking about here?
Well, he bases a lot of it on this idea of lineage, claiming that his branch is the only one that's truly stayed true to Herbert W. Armstrong's original teachings.
So it's all about maintaining that direct connection to Armstrong.
Exactly. But as we dig in, we're going to see that this claim might not hold up so well.
I'm all ears.
So Brisby lays out these 3 criteria for a valid baptism.
3 criteria. Okay, lay 'em on me.
First up, you've got to be one of God's called people.
Called people.
Yeah, he believes in this concept of first fruits, the idea that only a select few are being called by God at this point in history.
So there's already a sense of exclusivity built in. You can't just decide you want to join the club.
Exactly. You've got to be chosen.
Okay, so let's say you are one of the chosen few. What's next on the baptism checklist?
Criterion number 2. You need a genuine understanding of the covenant you're making at baptism.
Not just going through the motions, you're saying.
Right. It's not just about getting dunked in the water. You have to truly get the spiritual implications.
Okay, makes sense. But how does he define genuine understanding?
Well, he gets into some pretty specific doctrines that set his group apart from mainstream Christianity. Like he's big on the Old Testament law.
Old Testament law? You mean like the 10 Commandments?
Exactly. He believes that sin is specifically breaking God's law. And while he believes in grace, he sees it more like God pardoning past sins, not giving us a free pass to sin in the future.
So a very law-focused approach to Christianity.
That's putting it mildly. And then there's his take on accepting Jesus.
Oh, I'm sure he's got some unique thoughts on that too.
He does. He stresses accepting Jesus' true nature, which, according to him, is distinct from God the Father.
Distinct from God the Father. So he's not on board with the Trinity.
Nope, not at all. He also rejects the idea of an immortal soul, believes we're entirely mortal unless God specifically grants us a resurrection.
So to even qualify for baptism in his group, you have to buy into this whole set of pretty specific and, let's be honest, pretty controversial doctrines.
It's definitely a very exclusive club. But wait, there's one more hurdle to clear.
Okay, I'm bracing myself.
This one's a doozy. For a baptism to be valid, it has to be performed by an authorized minister, someone directly in the lineage of Herbert W. Armstrong himself.
Lineage again. But didn't Armstrong himself get baptized by a regular Protestant minister?
You're catching on.
So if Brisby's rules are the be-all and end-all, wouldn't that make Armstrong's own baptism illegitimate?
It's a huge contradiction.
A massive one. So how on earth does he try to explain that away?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting.
Yeah.
He brings in this concept of Moses' seat. Basically, he argues that some other Armstrongite offshoots, even if they've gone astray on some doctrines, might still have a sliver of God-given authority.
It's like they have a piece of the true power, but not the whole picture.
Exactly. But it seems awfully convenient, doesn't it?
Very convenient. Strict rules when it suits him, flexibility when it doesn't.
Totally. And it raises all sorts of questions about how these rules of authority actually work.
Big questions.
But before we go down that rabbit hole, let's take a closer look at Armstrong's baptism and how it totally clashes with Brisby's criteria.
All right, let's unravel this thing.
So according to historical records, Armstrong was baptized back in 1927 by the pastor of the Hinson Memorial Baptist Church.
Hinson Memorial Baptist Church, so a completely mainstream Protestant congregation.
Yep. And this was years before he even started his own church.
So right off the bat, we've got a problem with Brisby's whole called people and genuine understanding criteria.
Exactly. Armstrong hadn't even developed his unique doctrines at that point.
And then there's the whole lineage requirement. A Baptist pastor definitely wouldn't qualify under Brisby's rules.
So by Brisby's own logic, the very foundation of his movement is invalid.
Seems like it. Talk about a shaky foundation.
It's like he's built this elaborate house of cards, but the bottom card is missing.
A fascinating example of how religious leaders try to reconcile their beliefs with, shall we say, inconvenient historical facts.
It really is.
Yeah.
But let's shift gears for a moment and think about what this means for our listeners.
Okay, bring it home for us.
Because believe it or not, these arguments about baptism actually have real-world implications.
How so?
Well, Brisby's whole argument hinges on the idea that there's only one right way to do things, one true lineage of authority that traces back to him.
And that raises questions about how we figure out religious legitimacy, right?
Exactly. Who gets to decide what's true and what's not? And what happens to the people who don't fit into those neat little boxes?
Big questions. And not just for Armstrongites. This is something religious groups have struggled with throughout history.
Totally. And by looking at Brisby's arguments, we can get a better understanding of how these power dynamics play out.
I'm ready to dive deeper.
All right, deep divers, that's it for part 1. But stick around for part 2, where we'll really unpack Brisby's attempts to reconcile his rules with the messy reality of Armstrongism and what it all means for the rest of us searching for spiritual truth.
Can't wait.
All right, deep divers, welcome back. And last time we were left scratching our heads, how does Brisby get around this whole Armstrong baptism problem?
Yeah, it's a real conundrum. He sets up these super strict rules about valid baptisms, but then the founder of the very movement he claims to follow didn't even meet those criteria.
Exactly. It's like he's sawing off the branch he's sitting on. So how does he try to explain this away?
Well, he pulls out this concept called Moses' seat. It's kind of a biblical loophole.
Moses' seat. Okay. Now I'm really lost.
He's referring to this passage in the New Testament where Jesus tells his followers to listen to what the Pharisees say, even though they've become corrupt.
So respect the office, even if you don't respect the person.
Kind of like that Brisby uses this to argue that some of those other Armstrongite groups, even if they've messed up on certain doctrines, might still have a bit of God-given authority left over.
So they might still have the power to perform valid baptisms, even if they're wrong about other stuff.
That's his argument.
Yeah.
Basically, he's saying they're holding on to a little piece of the truth, even if they've strayed in other areas.
It seems awfully convenient, though, doesn't it? Kind of like he's making up the rules as he goes along.
It does make you wonder if he's just trying to have it both ways, strict when it suits him and flexible when it doesn't.
Yeah, a bit of theological maneuvering going on there.
Absolutely, and it really highlights how tricky it can be to establish religious authority, especially in movements that have splintered off like this.
Speaking of splintering, can we talk a bit more about these other Armstrongite groups that Brisby's referring to?
Sure, there's a whole bunch of them, all claiming to be the true heirs of Armstrong's legacy.
So what are some of the main points of contention that have caused these groups to split off?
Well, one big one is how to interpret the Old Testament law. Some groups like Brisby's are very strict, emphasizing the ongoing relevance of the Ten Commandments and all that.
Right, so they're still following all those Old Testament rules about food and clothing and everything.
Exactly, while other groups take a more relaxed approach, focusing more on the grace and forgiveness offered through Christ.
So it's the classic law versus grace debate.
Exactly, and then there's also disagreement about the role of prophecy. Armstrong was big on predicting the end times, and some groups have carried on that tradition while others have downplayed it or come up with different interpretations.
So even within Armstrongism, you've got this whole spectrum of beliefs, from those who are diehard Armstrong purists to those who've kind of gone their own way.
Absolutely. It's a really diverse landscape, and it just shows you that even within a seemingly unified religious movement, there's bound to be a lot of disagreement.
So how does Brisby justify accepting baptisms from groups he disagrees with?
He argues that as long as these other groups still hold on to certain core beliefs that set Armstrongism apart from mainstream Christianity, then their baptisms can be considered valid.
So there's like a hierarchy of beliefs in his mind.
Exactly. Some doctrines are non-negotiable, like their views on the holy days and the nature of God and the rejection of the Trinity.
But other doctrines are more flexible.
Right. He's basically saying, you can disagree with me on the details, but if you don't accept these fundamental tenets of Armstrongism, you're out.
It's all about drawing those lines in the sand.
Absolutely. And it raises some important questions about who gets to decide which beliefs are essential and which ones are just optional.
It's a slippery slope, isn't it? Because once you start down that road, it's easy to start excluding people who don't see things exactly the same way you do.
That's the danger of any kind of rigid ideology.
So let's bring this back to our listeners for a minute.
Sure. How does all of this connect to their lives?
I think the biggest takeaway here is the importance of critical thinking, especially when it comes to matters of faith.
Right. Don't just blindly accept what someone tells you, even if they claim to be an authority figure.
Brisby's a perfect example of how someone can sound very convincing. They can use scriptures and make logical arguments.
But it's important to look at the whole picture and to question those arguments.
Do your own research, think for yourself, and don't be afraid to challenge authority, even religious authority.
It's about taking ownership of your own spiritual journey.
Exactly. Don't let anyone else dictate your beliefs for you.
So well said.
And on that note, deep divers, we're going to take a short break. When we come back, we'll wrap up this deep dive by exploring the bigger implications of what we've learned from John Brisby and what it all means for those of us seeking spiritual truth in a world full of competing claims and conflicting interpretations. Stay tuned. All right, deep divers, we're back. And we're still trying to wrap our heads around John W. Brisby and his interesting take on baptism.
He really does present a fascinating case study, doesn't he? This whole idea that there's only one true lineage of authority when it comes to baptism.
Right. And the way he tries to balance that with the fact that there are all these other Armstrongite groups out there, some of which he clearly disagrees with.
It's like he wants to acknowledge that diversity exists, but he also wants to maintain that his group is the most legitimate.
It's that whole Moses seat concept that gets me.
Right. Like, these other groups might be wrong about certain things, but they still have a sliver of God-given authority.
But then how do you decide which doctrines are essential and which ones are negotiable?
Exactly. It seems like he's drawing some pretty arbitrary lines in the sand.
And it raises some big questions about how religious groups determine who's in and who's out.
Absolutely. And it's not just limited to Armstrongism. We see this kind of dynamic play out in all sorts of religious traditions.
So what's the takeaway for our listeners?
I think the biggest lesson here is the importance of critical thinking.
Especially when it comes to matters of faith.
Right. Don't just blindly accept what someone tells you, even if they claim to have all the answers.
Do your own research, ask tough questions, and be willing to challenge authority even if it makes you uncomfortable.
Exactly. And remember, there's no one-size-fits-all approach to spirituality. What resonates with one person might not resonate with another.
It's about finding your own path.
And trusting your own intuition.
All right, deep divers, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've explored the ins and outs of John Brisby's baptismal philosophy, uncovered some contradictions, and hopefully sparked some critical thinking along the way.
And if there's one thing we hope you take away from all of this, it's this: don't be afraid to question, to explore, to dig deeper.
Because at the end of the day, your spiritual journey is your own.
So keep searching, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.
We'll see you next time.